Hey guys, let's talk about Standard 2, which is on food chains and food webs. So when we look at the Standard 2 says food webs and food chains help to explain real-world relationships or events within an ecosystem. So this is going to build on Standard 1. So in Standard 1, one of the things we talked about was energy flow. So we talked about how energy flows unidirectionally, so one direction through an ecosystem, and it spreads by things eating each other. So this standard is going to look more specifically at that, how things eat each other and gain energy. So first we need to know some vocabulary. This is a good thing to be writing down. First vocabulary word we need to know are trophic levels. So the trophic levels are just groups of organisms that get their energy in different ways. So what we'll do is we're going to talk through the different trophic levels, what they are, what we name them. You're probably familiar with at least a few. So the first trophic level are producers. Producers are also called autotrophs. Autotrophs meaning they make their own food. So auto because they do it themselves, troph meaning to eat. So producers make their own food. These are typically plants or other bacteria. And what they do is they harness energy, most of the time, remember, from the sun. There are a few outliers that use chemical energy, but most use the sun. And they do a process called photosynthesis, which you talked about in Standard 1, or chemosynthesis, which is the same idea, just uses chemical energy to make sugar. So producers or autotrophs harness energy from the sun or chemical energy, and they make their own food. And again, plants are the best example we know of autotrophs, also called producers. Our next vocabulary word is consumers or heterotrophs. So consumers have to eat something, they have to consume something in order to get their own food. They cannot make it themselves. So heterotrophs, meaning they have to use something else to get their food. They cannot do photosynthesis. They cannot do chemosynthesis. They have to eat something. This is why you eat lunch, right? You can't photosynthesize. So some heterotrophs could be a lion, so it could be a hunter, something that's going to hunt something down and eat it. A squirrel, it's going to gather some acorns, things like that. A butterfly, anything you can really think of that doesn't do photosynthesis is a heterotroph. There are different kinds of heterotrophs, though. First are primary consumers. So a primary consumer is a heterotroph that's going to eat producers. So a primary consumer is going to eat plants or bacteria that undergo chemosynthesis or photosynthesis. Secondary consumer is going to eat primary consumers. So these guys are going to eat the guys that eat the plants. And you can kind of remember the back of your mind right now, Standard 2 is about food chains. You can kind of see this happening, right? You have the producer, it's eaten by the primary consumer, which is eaten by the secondary consumer. And of course, your consumers can be carnivores, herbivores, or omnivores. And you probably know what these terms mean. Carnivore, those guys eat only meat, so only eat other animals or organisms. Herbivores eat only plants. Omnivores eat a combination of both. So all consumers, all carnivores, herbivores, omnivores are types of consumers. All right, so now that we know the trophic levels, we can talk about food chains. So food chains are going to show the flow of energy from one organism to another. So now we're going to look at those trophic levels and kind of put them in an order that shows energy flow. So here's an example of a food chain. You can see here plankton, all the way up to your predator. It looks like a little shark there. And what you should notice is the direction of the arrow. So you can probably guess that the small fish doesn't eat the predator, right? But the arrow goes from the small fish to the predator. That's because the arrow is showing the flow of energy. So since the predator eats the small fish, the energy is going from the small fish to the predator. So your arrow direction should show the flow of energy. So again, a food chain, when you look at it, you should be able to identify the different levels we talked about. So the plankton, those are your autotrophs, right? Those are the guys that make their own energy. So they photosynthesize just like plants do, right? They live in the surface of the water where they can get some sunlight, and they're going to photosynthesize. The zooplankton, those are your primary consumers, right? They eat those plankton. Because they're primary consumers, they're also considered heterotrophs, and they're also considered herbivores, right? Assuming they only eat plankton. Fish larvae are next, right? Those are going to eat the zooplankton. Zooplankton are real small little guys. So those are the secondary consumers. So fish larvae are secondary consumers. Remember, all consumers are also called heterotrophs. And these guys you would consider to be a carnivore, again, assuming they only eat the zooplankton. So you can do that for any food chain that you see. We also have food webs. So in real life, there's not just one thing eating one thing, right? If you think about nature, there's lots of options. A predator can go after several different prey options. That's going to be shown in a food web. So they're a little bit more complex, but if you look at a food web, you're really just going to see multiple food chains within it. So if we look at an example here, you can see again, the direction of the arrow shows energy flow. And you can see something like the bald eagle has a couple of options of what it's going to eat. It might eat the large fish or it might eat the sea duck. Same idea here in terms of the zooplankton, what they get eaten by. They're going to get eaten by the small fish, but they also might be eaten by the bivalves. So there's options here. So it's just a little bit more complex, but you can break it down and see individual food chains within it. The last thing we need to talk about today are ecological pyramids. So when you look at those trophic levels in an ecosystem, you can organize them into a couple different pyramids. The first is a pyramid of energy. So pyramids of energy show energy transfer from one trophic level to the next, usually by percentage. Remember, it's the 10% rule. We learned this in Standard 1. Only 10% of the energy from one trophic level moves to the next when they're eaten. So you can see there at the bottom, those primary producers, or just producers as we'll call them, get 100% of the energy. But those primary consumers, the dudes that eat them, only get 10%. So a pyramid of energy is going to show you as you move up the trophic levels, the less energy is available. And you can see off to the side the reason all that energy is lost as heat. Another pyramid we can look at are pyramids of biomass. So biomass is just amount of living tissue. So it's like you're actually weighing the organisms at each trophic level. So you can see here in this pyramid, there's lots of the producer, some kind of shrub. There's not so many of the lion. So if you look at the biomass, if you weighed out all of those things, you can kind of organize them into a pyramid. Now remember, it's just the mass of them, so don't get this confused with pyramids of numbers. So pyramids of numbers actually count the number of organisms and organize them that way. So if you counted up the amount of producers you saw in an ecosystem, there'd probably be a lot more than if you counted up the number of top carnivores, right? So you're just going to count the number, and you can organize them into pyramids. All three examples I showed you just have the traditional kind of pyramid shape, but keep in mind they can also be inverted or spindle shaped. So this inverted one, the upside down pyramid, this would be an example. This is a pyramid of numbers where there's not that many producers. So if you look at large trees, there's not that many compared to the highest consumers here, which are hyperparasites, parasites that live on parasites. There's billions of them. They can also be spindle shaped. So the spindle shaped ones, you can see not so many producers, lots of primary consumers, and not so many secondary consumers. So the pyramids come in all shapes and sizes. So this is Standard 2. Once you watch the video, you're going to do the web quest, and then you're good to get back to your project. Let me know if you have any questions. Good luck.